Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to preface with some logistical things. I recognize this is at a time where not too many people are probably going to be able to attend SI sessions, so I do apologize. Again, this is all recorded, so you are welcome to view it at any point of the semester. My goal today is to highlight a lot of what we've spoken on specifically in week 10, and a little bit of what we talked about in week 9 with the Most We Could Do projects, as well as kidney donation. And so it's going to be a pretty brief lecture. I don't have a Kahoot, unfortunately, but I'll just run through everything that we've discussed, a lot of the notes that I took in class, and maybe some of the questions you guys can consider for this aspect of the unit for the test. So just to begin, a little bit of a recap for the Most We Could Do presentations. For the 12 o'clock session, we had a really good discussion on the videos that were presented. One thing I want to mention is that a project like this is pretty, I think is super beneficial for an intro level course such as social ethics. One thing about philosophy and specific ethics that a lot of people don't understand is there is a huge demand for being able to determine criteria for charities and for who we are to donate to. And so a project such as this is really good to get your feet wet and to help you understand how you in your professions, in your careers, or maybe in your church communities, or even in your own neighborhoods, how you're going to choose which charities to donate to. In my current job, I work at a local sporting goods store here in town. We get offers for, people come to us for donations nearly every single day. And unfortunately, it's not really possible for us to be able to donate to every single one of these charities. A lot of them have excellent causes. There's a lot of good organizations within here in Logan that we can, that we try to help support. But it's sometimes it's more than likely the case that we determine who is most beneficial, who is a cause that we think will promote the most good, who coincides with the values that we have in our own company. And there's a lot of debate and thought process for the charities that we donate to. And this is something you'll see in pretty much every one of your careers that you do with whatever field you go into. A lot of business students will have an opportunity in their own classes, especially if you're taking intro to management. I guess it'll depend on your professor, but in my intro to management class, I had the opportunity to pick a charity and then fundraise for $1,000 for the charity. So you'll have opportunities here probably in school too to think about criteria for charities to donate to, and I think a project like this is something that is super beneficial for all of us. So that being said, I think the consensus of our discussion focused on this kind of criteria for who we're going to give the $1,000 to. We talked about first our own limits. So when considering $1,000, we want to consider the overall amount of pleasure and pain that's going to be attributed to the charity that we're donating to. Another one of the criteria that we had talked about was long-term sustainability or immediate needs. So there was a balance here, and I think a little bit of a debate that we had here. Some of the organizations within the class were really focused on long-term sustainability, providing well water so that people can have water for a long period of time. And then there was issues such as malaria nets, where people need malaria nets now to save their lives. So there is a balance. What exactly are we trying to accomplish with our donations? Is it more important that we save people who are drowning now, as Peter Singer would put it, or are we trying to build better communities, give people the tools that they need so that they can provide these things for themselves? Along with that, criteria for organizations, this was another really important topic, I think, to consider. One of the questions that we asked was, well, how much of the proceeds are we donating to this organization are going to actually be used, and what are they going to be used for? I can't remember the student in his organization, but one of the students had mentioned that 100% of the proceeds is going to go directly to the project. So not a single dime is going to be used for any sort of logistical matters. It's all going straight to the people in the project that is working at hand. And sometimes that's what we're looking for. And sometimes maybe that's not. Maybe we're looking for a large portion to go towards the cause, but logistically it may be important that some money is invested to provide better work and to help the people get the work done that they need to. Another question that we asked was, how cost effective are the certain causes? So this is a really interesting question with the $1,000, because for us, $1,000, as a college student, maybe that does seem like a pretty substantial amount of money, but it also might not really seem like it's going to do too much. And so one of the questions that we had considered is, what is most cost effective for $1,000? The proposed idea for malaria nets is that, around $4 can buy you 2 malaria nets, which can save up to 4 people. 1 malaria net can save 2 people, or it could be used for 2 people. So in that case, yeah, we could save a lot of lives with $1,000. However, some people were proposing child sex trafficking. $1,000 would maybe, be very beneficial for these organizations, but probably wouldn't go towards saving as many people or doing as much justice for the cause as we'd hope for it to do. And so that's something to consider as well when we're considering our finalists. And then the last one, what needs are being addressed? And this kind of goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are we focusing on the basic levels of human necessity? Are we trying to provide food, shelter, comfort, or are we trying to address needs that are a little bit higher up in the pyramid, such as psychological needs, emotional needs, being able to help people sustain those type of needs as well. So those are type of things to consider. I would bring this up because I think this is a really important, this kind of criteria for the most we can do presentations is more than likely going to be something that we'll talk about on the test. Maybe not necessarily like specific projects that students have proposed, but more, what was the reasoning behind our class's consensus for choosing specific organizations? What ethical reasonings did we use to choose who we were going to give the money to? If you think through those type of things, questions around, the moral reasoning behind all that may or may not be something that we would put on the test. So that's just something to keep in mind. I apologize if you can hear my baby in the background. But moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about organ donations today, as well as moving into our final topic, where we talked about the ethics of suicide. Organ donations is a pretty interesting topic. We talked last week a little bit about the possibility of buying and selling our kidneys. So propose 2 different ideas here. Why would we allow for the sale of kidneys? First, one of the reasons that we had and given in the class was that the supply for kidneys would increase. So if we could sell our kidneys, if people had the opportunity to sell their kidneys, the idea is that a lot more people would do it than what's being done now with regular donations. And that may or may not be true. We mentioned a little bit in class about how the difference between like plasma donations and blood donations is kind of interesting. It seems that there is a lot more plasma donations than there is blood donations, and that could correlate with the fact that people get paid for their plasma donations. But I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure on that. I think that a lot more studies and tests can be done to determine that. But for the sake of argument, if that were the case, if people would be more willing to give their kidneys if they were to be paid for it, then the argument could be made that the supply of kidneys would increase by a ton more, and so we could save a lot more lives that way. Another idea for this is if we could sell our kidneys, we would be able to incentivize further technological advancement in kidney donation. A principle of economics is that when we're I guess in business, we can generate greater ideas for better, cost-effective type of production, so that companies can make a lot more money for what they do. So, if there's a business for kidneys, there is this potential for businesses to create ideas to provide kidneys at a much more rapid, safe, and cheap way, so that more people can have access to kidneys. And then finally, it also mitigates the black market buying and selling of kidneys. We talk about how a lot of right now, a lot of the buying and selling of kidneys is happening in the Middle East, and it's all completely down to the black market. So it's not legal, but people are still doing it, and they're doing it in very unsafe ways. They're doing it, in these, I guess, like hospitals that are, not quite as advanced as we could have here in the United States. And so there's a lot of potential problems right now with the buying and selling of kidneys, and it is occurring. Maybe not as rapid of a pace as we would think if it was legal to sell them, but it is happening, and it is kind of an issue with the potential risks of going to these countries, buying a kidney from some hospital that isn't sanitary, or is it struggles to provide the necessary means to do it effectively. And so that leads into some arguments against why we shouldn't allow for the buying and selling of kidneys. Why wouldn't we want to buy and sell kidneys? Well, first, the argument can be made that it would take advantage of poor communities. So people who do not need the money are not going to sell their kidneys. And so it's people who are in the need of the cash, who could use the money, who are going to be the ones who are selling the kidneys. And the issue with this is there is health issues that correlate with selling with only having one kidney. It's possible to live with only one kidney, but there are adverse health effects towards those who sacrifice their kidney. And then along with that idea is those with more money would be able to buy kidneys more than those who have less income. So if people could buy kidneys rather than receive donations for them, the idea is that they could pay more to get their kidneys, and it kind of pushes people who can't afford the kidneys towards the bottom of the list. And then the final point here is the businesses would take advantage of the bottom line and would find ways to have the biggest profit margins. So this is kind of contradictory to what I mentioned above about the incentivization of ideas. Is if businesses are, if there's a market for kidneys, buying and selling kidneys, the eventual goal will be to have the highest profit margins for selling kidneys. So this could mean finding people who are willing to sell their kidneys at a very, very cheap cost, and then selling those kidneys at a very high cost if the demand is high enough. And the argument was made in class that if we could sell kidneys, the demand for kidneys would go down drastically, which definitely could be the case. But it's still, there still is a potential problem for, these businesses to come in and to find really cheap bottom line workers who are going to sell their kidneys at a very low cost, which again takes advantage of communities with low income. And then going into Sabiri and I don't know how to say his name, Budiani, their argument. I think this also kind of, the last points that were made there kind of ties into what their opposition towards the selling of kidneys. Their arguments were essentially that donors, they enter health problems. So, if someone sells their kidney, again, you can live with one kidney, but it's not ideal. It can definitely impact your health and cause a lot of failure in the future. They also made the argument that the extra money does little to help those in need. It usually was used to pay off debts, and the health consequences of selling their kidneys were far greater than the actual money that they were receiving. And since the money was used to pay off debts, it really didn't provide any sort of quality of life. It was basically there to just meet the needs that they had at the time. So, they were kind of pushed into the idea is that people will be pushed into a corner where they have no other option. They'll sell their kidneys and they'll take the money that they can get so that they can something they can provide for themselves. So it kind of takes advantage of those people in some way, where we're giving them no other option but to to sacrifice their health so that they can get the money that they need. And then they made an interesting observation. 94% of all vendors who had donated a kidney said they essentially regretted their decision to do so. So that says a lot about maybe some of the health consequences for selling one of your kidneys. And then the final point is that the vendors are socially ostracized. And I think what we had talked about in our class about this was essentially those who sell their kidneys kind of become looked at differently socially from their families and their peers. They thought, why would you sell your kidney? Why would you sacrifice your life that way? And so there was some social detrimental impacts from that, because and I think that it was mainly just because people were they were worried that if they were to get sell their kidneys, then their families would kind of look down on them for doing that. Okay, and then going into Janet Richards, she is much more of a advocate for the buying and selling of kidneys. She thinks that making the buying and selling of kidneys legal would make abuses, so issues with the black market, less common. And this definitely may be true. The idea that if we, if we're going to legalize certain illegal activities, then there's no need to do things underground in situations where it's a lot more difficult and a lot more dangerous to do. If we could do it legally, we could provide much more safer facilities for people to donate their kidneys to, or for operations to proceed. She also makes the claim that people with less income are competent enough to make the decisions to sell their kidneys. So I think she's appealing to a specific argument where, we're taking advantage of poor communities that maybe wouldn't have the proper competence to make this decision. And she's saying that that's just completely false. If these people have the correct mental capacity to donate their kidneys, then how is that any different from them being able to choose if they're going to sell their kidneys or not? And I'm not sure who specifically she's appealing to in this argument, but the argument that she would be counter opposing to is the idea, again, that people who are going to sell their kidneys really don't have the rational ability to make the proper decision, which again is not 100% true. And Janet Richards, I think she addresses that pretty well. And then another point she makes is that the questions of life-saving procedures from altruism. So the idea here is that she's saying, like, why would we only allow donations of kidneys when people are in need of it? She's saying, that the life-saving remedies do not need to only be charity. If we can sell them, why wouldn't we do that? It's good to save more lives in the long run, and so we don't need to leave these things up to charity, basically, or to altruism, as she puts it. And then the final point that I mentioned here is why would we rob low-income families from options that can help them financially? So this addresses that concern again, where the counter argument is it pushes people with lower income into a situation where they feel like they have no other option but to sell their kidneys for the money that they need. And she's essentially saying, why would we even rob them of an opportunity to make money in this way? Why would we take this option away if it's completely, viable? If they can already donate their kidneys, if allowing them to make money on it instead just gives them another option towards becoming in a better financial state if they need it. Okay, so just moving on from kidney donations into our next topic that we discussed this week of ethics of punishment and organ donation. So our discussion here was similar to our kidney buying and selling kidney discussion, except for we talked a little bit more about the donation of liver And instead of buying and selling livers, we talked about the idea of who should we prioritize when receiving livers? Is there certain people who we should disqualify from receiving a liver transplant, such as people who have destroyed their liver through alcoholism? And so we talked about two major arguments. First, in the Brudney article, Brudney was a lot more optimistic towards being able to allow people who have already damaged the liver through alcoholism to be able to still receive the treatment that they need and receive the donation of livers that they need. So it's, the first point I mentioned here is that people must have appropriate knowledge if they are to be held responsible. So the idea here is that Brudney thinks that people who destroy their liver the first time may not necessarily have the appropriate knowledge of what the alcohol consumption is doing for their liver. And so alcoholics, in need of a transplant may not have had the appropriate knowledge. And so they're not really held as high as a responsibility as we put them at by saying, they completely destroyed their body. They should have known better. And he's not saying that. He's saying essentially, they may not have had the appropriate knowledge needed to make that decision. But then this also leads into another point where he says, if someone has had a liver transplant already, then they already have had sufficient knowledge. So this kind of gives the idea that if somebody has destroyed their liver, they've received a transplant, and then they just go on and continue to destroy their liver, then at that point they've pretty much received the knowledge they need, and they could be held accountable for being at a less priority for receiving a liver transplant. And this final point I put was that just because someone is responsible for their own suffering does not mean that we have no obligation to help them. So I think that these 2 points are kind of at the core of what Brudney was trying to argue for organ donations. He thinks that we should still consider anybody who has suffered through alcoholism to be able to receive a kidney, and that we shouldn't, negate their need for life-saving remedies just because they've destroyed their lives. And of course, the main question is, well, what about somebody who has lived a completely healthy life? They've never drinking alcohol, but they have liver failure. Why is it fair for them to be put at a lower priority than somebody else who has destroyed their liver? And honestly, Brudney really never answers this question. He kind of dances around it a little bit. But I think his argument mainly is for the fact that we shouldn't disconsider people who have destroyed their livers through alcoholism. If there ever is a situation where we have to choose between one or the other, honestly, I think, I don't know if Brudney would, I can't remember if Brudney answered this question or not. But it seems fair to say that he would try to advocate for both, that both are a necessary need. We shouldn't negate one or the other, but both, have essentially the same need for life-saving remedies that we can provide. And then just briefly here in the Bramstead and Jabbour article, their approach to the liver transplants was kind of different. They had a lot more of a structure for their approach to helping alcoholics receive liver transplants. They were the ones that believed in the 6-month sobriety rule. So if you were in need of a transplant, you had to show your sobriety by not having any sort of alcohol for at least 6 months, or being sober for 6 months. They give a lot of case studies where people, there was one guy who had one drink, and I think it was on Father's Day. And the question was, well, this one drink in 6 months, is this something that should take them off this waiting list period? In our class, I think we kind of came to the consensus that, one drink really wouldn't be a big deal. But there's counter arguments to that. If someone is serious about, acting out sobriety for life-saving remedies, they probably wouldn't have made that decision in the first place. And I think that, some of the goals for this 6-month sobriety rule kind of plays to that. They think that, somebody who can live 6 months in sobriety without any drinks, it's possible that they won't even need a liver transplant after, because they've, kind of curbed the negative consequences by being sober for that long. That's a possibility. They also think that the The 6-month rule shows the seriousness, and so anybody who can't follow that 6-month rule, it kind of weeds out basically those who are going to have long-term sustainability with their new liver, rather than those who will probably relapse and go back to their alcoholic habits. Okay, and then briefly, just from our discussion in class yesterday, just want to quickly recap what we talked about on the ethics of suicide. So Nemoto, he was a Buddhist priest. He focused on providing counsel and aid towards the hikikomori. The hikikomori were people in Japan, in South Korea, who basically were hermits in their room. They were very depressed individuals. They basically played video games all day, and they had a lot of mental health issues. And so Nemoto, after going through his trial in the temple, and going through this complete transformation, he decides to dedicate his life towards helping people in need, who have these suicidal tendencies. His practices in the beginning were they were pretty extreme. He had a website where people would post and call him and kind of describe their symptoms and everything that they were going to. And Nemoto would spend all day, every day, answering these people, talking to these people, and trying to offer them counsel. And so he spent nearly his entire life nearly his entire time every day trying to provide help and relief for these people, all until the point where he received his own health problems. We discussed he kind of had a little bit of heart failure, which caused him to not be able to spend as much time with these people. So in the process, he had to approach how he helped these people a lot differently. In this process, the hikikomori were, these people who were coming to him for help. They complained. They thought, his actions were selfish. And in one of the letters that one of the people had addressed to him, essentially they talked about how Nemoto was like the hikikomori, how he was not enduring the pain that he needed to, so that he could help other people. Essentially, he came to the conclusion that these people were completely reliant upon him and were not doing anything that they needed to do to help themselves. And so, one interesting part of the logic behind these people's complaints is the hikikomori seek to avoid pain. They do everything they can to rely on Nemoto to alleviate any sort of the pain that they feel. And Nemoto realizes that in order for somebody to receive peace and happiness, or in Buddhist context, Zen, you have to endure pain. You have to face pain head on, and you have to make it through it in order to receive that peace. And so, because these people were avoiding pain, Nemoto thought, his logic shifted towards helping these people make big sacrifices and take the steps that they needed to, so that they can also experience this going through pain, working through pain, and receiving happiness that they needed. So the rules that he changed essentially were, instead of having this website where people can just reach out to him at any time, he required for these people to come and find him and take a difficult journey, where they would have to find him in the temple. It was at this time that Nemoto thought that it was no longer his moral obligation to help these other people. I have these questions here at the end to kind of summarize a lot of the discussion that we had. But what was his reasoning for this? I think, honestly, he recognized that it was an intellectual stimulation or an intellectual activity for these people, and so he was these people's guide, but it wasn't his moral obligation for him to be the crutch or be the person that these people always had to turn to for the peace that they needed. Instead, I think his moral obligation was to help them receive the Zen and happiness that they would need by helping them go through the trials they needed to go through. So this is kind of an interesting way to end, I think, the discussion thus far in the semester, because this is a little bit different type of moral reasoning than we've had discussion of in the past. So we started the semester off really focusing on strict utilitarians and altruism through them. So I think, the question here, how would a strict utilitarian respond to Nemoto's reasoning? Well, I don't think they would think his methods are as effective as they could be. We look at Aaron, we look at Julia, we look at these people who sacrifice absolutely everything for the greater good. And I think that they would also think that Nemoto's reasoning for why it's not his moral obligation to be these people's crutch or to be these people's savior in a sense. I don't think they would think that's good moral reasoning. They particularly would sacrifice absolutely everything for the greater good, and they would sacrifice their mental health issues. They would really care less about themselves, and they would do everything they can to maximize as much pleasure for as many things as they possibly can. And this is not to say that Nemoto's actions are necessarily wrong or that they're lacking any sort of moral value. I think it shows the difference in maybe a utilitarian's mindset compared to who we would consider Nemoto to be a virtue ethicist. And I don't know, I think that may be something to think about for those who are watching this lecture later on, is why is Nemoto a virtue ethicist? What is something that makes up a virtue ethicist? And why is that different from most utilitarians? Do virtue ethicists focus on maximizing any sort of happiness for other people? And in Nemoto's case, what was his end goal for helping these people? Was it seemed like trying to help them have a better life, overcome their pain, to receive greater happiness, but he did it on a smaller scale. So I'm going to go ahead and end it there. If you guys have questions about the lecture, please feel free to email me, talk to me in class, or talk to Dr. Otteson, and we'd be happy to chat with you guys. Thanks for watching.